What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and I was drinking my morning cup of coffee and I was reading the X-Men comics, and then it just, boom, occurred to me out of nowhere. I think Marvel Comics just gave us the origin to Thanos and mutants in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and I think Eros is the key to understanding it. So here's what we're gonna do. If you guys wanna know the full-on origin, if you guys wanna be experts on X-Men, mutations, all that kind of stuff, I'm gonna link a playlist down in the description that will send you over to Comics Explained and make you an expert on everything related to the X-Men. But for the purpose of this video, I'm gonna give you guys the quick and dirty explanation in terms of how mutations used to work, because you have to understand that to understand what I'm gonna tell you here in a second and how it rolls over into the Marvel Cinematic Universe and how Eros and everything ties into it. So, wind the clock back to the early days in Marvel Comics, right? And the way that the mutant origin was explained to us was simply saying that mutation was a result of genetic modification at the hands of the Celestials. That in the early days of Earth, the Celestials showed up on Earth and they modified a portion of humanity called the Wanderers. The idea was that this genetic modification led to the creation of the Eternals, it led to the Deviants, and then it led to the genetic modification of some of these humans so that at some future point in time, they would start developing powers. And so the idea behind mutants in Marvel Comics for decades has always been that they were just the evolutionary next step, right? They didn't really know, at least in the early days, they didn't know that Celestials were responsible or the ones that caused their mutation in the first place. Guys like Gabriel Shepard, the proto-mutants, things like that, basically brought all this to light, finding the dreaming Celestial and so on and so forth. A lot of this has been explained over the years, and the X-Men are aware of their heritage regarding the Celestials nowadays. What Marvel is doing now, though, is they're changing this. What they're saying, and this really comes by way of the current Judgment Day event, which we're covering over at Comics Explained, what they're doing is they're changing the origin of mutants and referring to it as something called excess deviation. In effect, mutations as they exist in Marvel Comics are not the result of genetic modification at the hands of the Celestials. It is, but it isn't. Instead, what they're saying is that it's excess deviation. That in effect, what seems to have happened is that in the early days of human history, a deviant banged a human, and when that happened, they popped out somebody that had a blend between human and deviant genes. And what that meant is that where excess deviation in relation to deviants means that deviants undergo what's called, quote unquote, the change, where they just kind of turn into like some grotesque monster version of themselves, that when humans undergo the deviant change, they develop powers, right? Cyclops' eyes turn into portals to another dimension full of energy, Jean Grey can read minds and move stuff, and Nightcrawler can teleport. That's how those things work, right? That's how this excess deviation basically works in relation to humanity. Now, take that concept and roll it over into the MCU. What do we know about Thanos? What do we know about the origin of Thanos? We know virtually nothing. All we know is that Thanos was part of a group of godlike beings that existed on Titan, and he told them, hey, there's too many of us and there's not enough resources. We gotta like wipe out half of us so that we can allow those who continue to exist to move on without having to die of starvation until such a time as you morons decide you wanna overpopulate again, and then we gotta start the whole process all over again. That's all we really know. And that his race ultimately ignored him, the entire society collapsed, and that was the end of that. Thanos took it as essentially a verification that his ideology was true. He took off into the universe, formed his own Coal Obsidian, and literally just started manually killing off half the population of every world until he found the Infinity Stones, and then snapped his fingers and did it in one fell swoop. Done and done. Now, let's look at the character of Eros, right? Eros is an Eternal. What do we know about the Eternals? The Eternals are not the result of genetic modification by the hands of the Celestials. They were created by the Celestials. They are inorganic. They're basically robots. And Eros is no different from that. Now, there was an interview that Chloe Zhao had done where she had basically talked about the ending of the Eternals film and talked about the nature of Eros. And the question was, if Eros is the brother of Thanos, but Thanos is not a robot, then how do we square that circle? And the response of Chloe Zhao is Eros is an Eternal in the same way that like Ajax and Icarus and all them are Eternals. He's not biological. He is a robot. The difference is that he was stationed on Titan just like any other group of Eternals across the universe by the Celestials, and he was brought into the royal family and became the adoptive brother of Thanos. He's not his biological brother. And so with that in mind, now we know that Thanos, at least is on a genetic level, Thanos and Eros stand apart. That answers the question of how can an Eternal be related to a biological being if the Eternals are robots? Having said that, here's what I think happened, and here's what I think the origin is of Thanos in the MCU. And here is why I think the mutant population is not confined to Earth, that there are mutants all across the universe, and Thanos was one of them. What I think happened was this, that the story that we're told in terms of the deviants in the Eternals film, that's the broad strokes, right? It's just like, here's the whole history of humanity. We were created and we did some stuff and then yada, 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 blah, 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 blah. But it's the broad strokes. It doesn't show the nuances. For every rule, there's an exception to the rule. So sure, deviants as a race in general basically ended up starting out destroying all the different apex predators of worlds, then became apex predators themselves, and then basically became ultra-violent, which led to the formation of the Eternals to destroy the deviants, and then the Eternals taking over the role of safeguarding the different races across the world. But there has to be an exception to that, that by whatever manner and whatever means, it's inevitable that not every single deviant across the entirety of the universe is some ultra-violent being that exists out there. So is it that far outside the realm of possibility to believe that on Titan, there were deviants, and one of those deviants did not become ultra-violent, and one of those deviants basically slept with whatever that race happened to be on Titan, which is not an offshoot of the Eternals. It may just be a race that just evolved there on their own. And that led to the introduction of deviant genes to the Titan population, which is where you get Thanos from. It would explain why it is that like so many of these different beings all basically look the same, but then Thanos suddenly looks different. It works that way in Marvel Comics all the time. You have a group called the Morlocks, right? 99% of mutants that exist in Marvel Comics on Earth look like humans. The 1% are the Morlocks. They usually end up taking residence in the sewers of New York City. You do have exceptions like people like Nightcrawler or something like that, but most all mutants look like human beings. It's just kind of one of the caveats of the mutant population of Marvel Comics is how they make them relatable to the average reader. So it's not outside the realm of possibility that deviant genes were just passed down from one generation to the next, and by random chance or whatever the case happens to be, Thanos is just the deviant that happened to look different. Even in Marvel Comics, in Thanos' own history, that's the case, right? That like literally he possesses a deviant gene, and most of the Eternals possess a deviant gene because it was just passed on from one Eternal to the next. We're literally told that in the story, or at least that's alluded to in the story, and then Thanos just looks different. So it's not that far outside the realm of possibility that Thanos is a member of this race that exists on Titan, but he just looks different because his deviant gene physically manifested. That's why he appears the way he does. But at his core, unlike Marvel Comics, where at his core Thanos is a human, in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, he was a mutant, right? It would explain why he was so large. It would explain his excess physical strength, how he was able to overpower somebody like the Incredible Hulk. He is a non-gem powered version of Juggernaut from the X-Men comics. Tell me I'm wrong, right? The Juggernaut's gone toe-to-toe physically with the Incredible Hulk multiple times. He's got a healing factor, all that kind of stuff. Thanos he's very Juggernaut-esque in terms of how he functions. Now, under normal circumstances, you would just chalk that up to his genealogy, but if you throw in the idea that mutants basically come into existence whenever it is that a deviant procreates with a particular individual of a normal, what you would consider to be a human-like race, then it makes perfect sense that Thanos would basically be a mutant. You take that and you apply it to Earth. Let's say, for example, that of all the deviants that exist out there, right, Crow is not your normal deviant. He wasn't just arbitrarily destroying things. And even it seems the explanation that we get about deviants in Eternals may not actually be true, because the explanation comes by way of the Eternals themselves, and the Eternals are programmed. So literally, they're giving us the origin of the deviants as it was put in their programming, and that's basically it. But it's not outside the realm of possibility that some deviant out there banged some human, and that led to the introduction of deviant genes into the human gene pool. Walk away with this idea of what Marvel's doing in Judgment Day, and that the development of mutant powers is just the human equivalent of the change that deviants undergo because of excess deviation. It makes perfect sense, and that may very well be our introduction of mutants in the MCU. For me, like, nothing else fits. Maybe it is just kind of some arbitrary evolutionary change, right? Somewhere along the line, just something clicked in the human gene pool, and now they've all got powers. But if they really want to tie Thanos and deviants and all this kind of stuff together, and Marvel Comics usually follows in line with the MCU, unlike the way it used to be. It used to be the Marvel Cinematic Universe followed the comics, now it's the other way around. Because Marvel Comics follows the MCU, this kind of makes sense. It makes sense that what we're getting here with Thanos is that he's basically a mutant among his own people. That on Earth, mutants came into existence because somewhere along the line, the deviant gene was introduced to the human gene pool, and that's where mutants come from. By whatever manner and whatever means, they're just now activating, or at least as we're aware of, they could have been activating all this time, just popping up, and it would take somebody like Xavier to start organizing them into a team that we call the X-Men, and you just kind of go from there. But let me know what you guys think, right? Do you guys think there's a solid chance that this is true, that this is the way this is working and going forward in the MCU, that the mutant population, or mutants as we know them, are not strictly confined to Earth, that they're actually all over the place across the universe? Let me know what you guys think. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.